All right, let's talk real quickly about what our respiratory system does for us. Number one, providing for gas exchange, which is, I would say, its primary role, taking up oxygen for the transport in our blood to our body cells, and then expelling carbon dioxide waste that's produced during cellular metabolism. Okay. And the removal of carbon dioxide, that actually allows us to regulate our acid-base balance, and that's through what we call the bicarbonate buffer system, which is stuff I'll get into in physiology, not so much in this class. But if you were to not expel your carbon dioxide, your CO2, it actually can combine with water and become an acid, which is going to really throw a kink in, a lot of systems that could be very detrimental to your health. So that's an important function. Number three is just kind of a collection of different things. Contains receptors for the sense of smell, and so we'll be talking a little bit more about the nose that we've talked about a couple different points this semester. Filtering inspired air, producing sounds for vocalization, and excreting small amounts of water and heat. Okay. Now, the process of supplying the body with oxygen and removing carbon dioxide is known as respiration, and so that's where the term respiratory system comes from. It involves the act of breathing, what we call ventilation of the lungs, but also the exchange of gases between our air and our blood. This is what takes place in our lungs, and then between our blood and our tissue fluids, that takes place out in the structures of the body, whether it's the brain, skeletal muscles, all the way down to the tips of your toes. And then the use of oxygen in cellular metabolism, which would be where we take that oxygen into our mitochondria. We use that to go through what's called the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which some of you will probably cringe just hearing those words. We won't get into any of that, but that's where we make our energy, and that's why we breathe, so that we can, get energy that our structures of the body need. As far as the structures go, there's kind of two different ways to kind of categorize and break things down. You can do it structurally and then functionally. Structurally, we break them down into upper and lower tracts or systems. The upper respiratory tract or system includes the nose, the nasal cavity, the divisions of the pharynx, because there's three of them, and then the associated structures. Here is an illustration kind of very nicely showing you those different components. This figure is actually from a different textbook. This one's the one that you will find in your textbook. Neither of these pictures will be on the exam. I included them both because I really like how they bracketed things out here versus over here. There's some of those same things, but a few different things labeled. You got the lower respiratory tract, which is essentially everything below the larynx or below the pharynx. It includes the larynx, what we commonly call our voice box, the trachea, what we commonly would call our windpipe, all segments of the bronchial tree, which is an air duct networking system inside our lungs, and then obviously our lungs as a whole as well. Functionally, we divide the respiratory system into two zones, what we call the respiratory zone and the conducting zones. Okay, the conducting zone filters, warms, and moistens air and conducts it into the lungs. So it's just airways that push the air into the lungs. It runs from the nose and includes everything down to what we call the terminal bronchioles, which are some of our smaller branches of the bronchial tree. We'll learn about all these different segments here in a little, well, not today probably, but later in the lecture. Respiratory zone includes the tubes and tissues within the lungs where the actual gas exchange occurs, includes respiratory bronchioles, and then alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli, which are microscopic structures. If I zoom in, they've actually shown them here in the picture. I essentially think of alveoli, which are the actual structures that perform gas exchange. Those are what are surrounded by our pulmonary capillaries, those blood vessels that we've kind of talked a little bit about before. Okay, they're hollow little sacs inside our lungs. Your lungs are more like a sponge than like a hollow balloon-like structure that a lot of people like to think they are. But they do have these tiny little balloons. There's over 1 million of them in each of our lungs. Each of those alveoli is surrounded by a pulmonary capillary system. Okay, they are held together in clusters, and as you can see, one of those is labeled as an alveolar sac. Okay, those are fed by what's called an alveolar duct, and so those are some of the things that were just mentioned. I always tell students kind of think of these like grapes. Each grape is like an alveolus, which is a singular form of the word alveoli. They grow in clusters like grapes do. That's what a sac is. And then if you want to think of like the alveolar duct, it's kind of like the stem of the grape cluster. Like I said, neither of these images will be on the exam, so don't worry about those. Here on the next page is a figure from your textbook. It's the essentially same view there of the chest and into the neck, but from a cadaver, where you can see the lungs very nicely. You can see some of the structures we've talked about very recently, like the heart, the pericardial sac that's holding it. There's the aorta. We can see stuff here, though, that's related to what we'll talk about here, which includes this trachea structure, the larynx, which is our voice box. There's the thyroid gland that we've previously learned about. So some kind of cool stuff to see, but nothing to worry about. I don't have that in your version of the lecture anyway. So, all right, we're going to start at the top and work our way down, beginning with the nose, which, as I've mentioned, we've talked about a few different times this semester, all the way back to when we first learned about the bones of the body. We talked about the bones associated with the nose. Nose has both internal and external structures that aid in filtering, warming, moistening, and chemically examining the air entering our body. So we can kind of break down the nose into two distinctive parts, external nose and then the internal nose, or what you'll also see listed as the nasal cavity, which is actually what I had it listed on as the previous page. External nose portion of the nose visible on the face consists of a supporting framework of bone, hyaline cartilage, covered with muscle and skin and lined by mucous membrane. When people talk about their nose, that's the part of the nose they typically are thinking of. It's because what we can see, what we can feel, what you can pick, and so on and so forth. Okay. Well, the internal nose or nasal cavity is a large cavity beyond the nasal vestibule in the anterior space of the skull, lies inferior to the nasal bone, superior to the mouth. This is a pretty deep space, and for those of us who've had COVID tests, which I imagine everybody has at this point in time, you understand just how far back in your nasal, far back in your head your nasal cavity really is, and can really appreciate that. When I used to teach this before those COVID tests were a thing, kind of probably hard for students to imagine just how far back things were. Let's talk more about the external nose. There's kind of two major parts to it, the bony framework and the cartilaginous framework. Bony framework comes from the following bones: the singular frontal bone, which, as we learned previously, is the forehead bone. Then you got the two nasal bones, which are obviously part of the nose. They kind of form the bridge of the nose. And then kind of the side walls of the nose come from the two maxilla, your upper jaw bones. Okay. The cartilaginous framework consists of the septal nasal cartilage, which is going to form the anterior portion of our nasal septum. Remember, the nasal septum we've talked about before is the divider that creates the two different sides of your nose. There's two lateral cartilages, which are inferior to the nasal bones. Then you have alar cartilages that form a portion of the walls of our nostrils. Okay. And those are all shaded blue in our picture. There's one final segment to the nose that doesn't really get a special name like the cartilaginous framework or the bony framework. And it is kind of here going to form the rest of the nostril. What we can see here is it's made up of dense fibrous and connective and adipose tissues. And so that's the final structure. On the undersurface of the external nose are the two openings that I've already mentioned. What we would commonly call them are the nostrils. That's what you have to stick your finger up into if you want to pick your nose. Fancier term for them are external nares. Now, if you replace this letter E with an I, and that spells naris, that would make it singular. So if you're labeling one, like in this case, can only see one, you would use the letter I there instead of E, which I would actually go ahead and draw in and label that as the external naris / nostril. because I do want you to know that as well as the rest of the structure that are labeled here in this picture. All right, let's talk more about the internal nose or nasal cavity. I already read through all that. Okay, so I won't do that again. Lined with muscle and a mucous membrane. Anteriorly, it merges with the external nose. Posteriorly, it connects with the pharynx through two openings, what we call the internal nares, or choani, which is a fun word to say. These are the openings that lead to your throat, and that's what your pharynx is, what we would commonly call our throat. So this is where the air leaves the nose and enters our throat. Okay, and same situation if you replace the E here and put an I in there, that makes it singular. And actually, if I jump ahead a couple slides, I went too far. There it is. One of those is labeled because we have half the head here. There's the internal nares labeled like so. All right, ducts from the paranasal sinuses and the nasolacrimal ducts also open into the internal nose, which we've talked about before. Remember, the paranasal sinuses are things, little cavities inside certain bones, like in our forehead. We've got two frontal sinuses. We've got them in our cheeks, thanks to the maxilla bones. We'll see those again on the next page. Nasolacrimal duct, remember, that's going to carry tears or lacrimal fluid from our eyes into our nasal cavity, especially when we're crying, and that's what makes our nose run. Nasal vestibule is the anterior portion of the nasal cavity, just inside the nostrils, lined with the skin, and contains coarse hairs, which help filter out large dust particles. This is where, like the boogers will collect that you can pick out, and obviously the hairs as well that are there. I always joke that for whatever reason, guys, as we get older, the hair gets longer and longer and more significant, which is why grandpas have so much nose and ear hair as well. Nasal septum, once again, vertical partition dividing the nasal cavity into the right and left sides. Anterior portion is composed primarily of hyaline cartilage. You can see a little bit of it here, and then on the outside where it's labeled in our picture. That's the part that can get pierced, okay? The remainder is formed by the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, maxillary and palatine bones, and is made up of bone, so it is much more rigid. And that's what we can really see nicely here in this picture. On the right side of the page is actually from a cadaver where essentially the face has been removed. So we're looking pretty far back into the nasal cavity. Gives you a good view of the two maxillary sinuses. But this is the nasal septum. You've probably heard of a deviated septum before. This one looks a little deviated, not too terrible. I mean, probably no septum is going to be nice and straight up and down. But as you can see, it's a little cockeyed, which could affect airflow, which I'll get to here in a second. Okay. Inferiorly, nasal cavity is bordered by both the hard and soft palate, which are going to be the roof of our mouth. Hard palate's formed by the palatine and maxillary bones, and the soft palate's made up of muscle, which we'll talk more about here in this lecture, but also into the next lecture, more so actually in the next lecture. Lateral the walls of the internal nose are formed by the ethmoid, the maxillary, the lacrimal, the palatine, and the inferior nasal concave bones. So there's a lot of structure to the lateral walls. The ethmoid is what forms the roof, and that's what we would call the cribriform plate, which we've talked about before. Deep within the nasal cavity are three folds of tissue formed by the facial bones, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, which you can see them are these little hooks that are labeled as such, not to be confused with the meatuses that you see labeled there. These conchae project from the lateral walls towards the center of the nose, and they create these little channels that the air must flow through. Okay, you may have heard them described as turbinates before. That's what they also go by, but the conchae is what your textbook describes them as, so that's what I'll go with. But the meatuses are these channels, okay, and what the function of them is to allow for the air just to kind of get really moistened and warmed and filtered as it passes through, so that, you know, the lungs aren't getting dirty, cold air, essentially, and really dry air. That would not be good either. And it's really kind of hard on our throats. As you guys know, in the wintertime, when you wake up, you got a sore throat a lot of times because your house is so dry, especially if you sleep with your mouth open, you're not getting that benefit of these guys. We've talked about this before, but the olfactory receptors are the cells that lie in a region of the membrane lining the supranasal conchae and adjacent septum called the olfactory epithelium. We've talked about all that before, so I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that, nor am I going to worry about you needing to know that image on the right, just this one on the left. All right, let's talk about those paranasal sinuses, as well as some accessory structures that are visible and some pictures that we're going to color here at the bottom of the page. We've talked about each and every one of these things before. It's been a while for most of it, though, so this is a nice refresher. And we'll do that now. All right, the paranasal sinuses plus some other stuff. Remember, the paranasal sinuses are air-containing space in the facial bones, open or drain in the nasal cavity, and they're lined with the mucous membrane, just like the interior of our nose, and unfortunately can get infected and lead to some pretty painful situations, which I'm sure some of you had that happen before. Okay. Function of them is to actually kind of lighten up the skull and add a little bit of timbre or complexity to the voice, which is why, you know, if you're all blocked up, especially up into these sinuses, your voice might be a little deeper. Okay. All right, let's talk and highlight them. Just color code them real quickly. First, go pink here for the frontals. Sphenoid is a singular. I'll color orange. Got baby blue for the maxillaries. Go black for the ethmoids because they're very large, or very small, I mean, so I want them to stand out. Mastoids, I'm going to go with this kind of aqua color. And then I'll do yellow for the nasal duct. Okay, letter A illustrates your frontal sinuses very nicely. We've got them in all three images. Here's our just straight on anterior view. I don't know why they have a letter A on one, but not the other. The one on the right side of the face, actually, they show you where the duct is going to drain into and connect to the nasal cavity. So I'll go ahead and draw that. That's between the middle and the inferior nasal conchae. Over on the right, this is essentially kind of like the same view that was on the previous page where the face has been removed. So we're seeing farther back into the nasal cavity. And then here on the bottom, our lateral view, we can see one of the two. Now, this bottom image is the only image that's going to allow you to see letter B, which is the sphenoid or sphenoidal sinus. Okay. It's located pretty darn centralized in our skull. You can kind of just draw a line straight back from the nose and just above your ear. Where those lines intersect, that's kind of where you'd find this sinus. And once again, that's a singular sinus. Whereas the frontals and these, the maxillaries, are duplicated. So we've got a pair of these. Maxillary sinuses are in your maxillary bones. Pretty good sized sinuses. This one on the right shows you where their duct connects to the nasal cavity. And then on the bottom, we can only see one since we can only see half the head. All right, the next sinuses are going to be called the ethmoidal sinuses or air cells. Not a singular cavity, but are small little pocket-like structures within the ethmoid bone. They all have their own kind of individual connection to the nasal cavity. I'm going to color them black. You can see them very nicely here in the lateral view. You can also see them in the other two views as well. Pretty darn centered right between your eyes. All right, similar to those, but they don't connect to the nasal cavity. Really, the only reason I included them is because they're visible in the picture, and that's letter E, what we call the mastoid air cells, similar to those ethmoids, and that they're tiny little pockets. But instead of connecting to the nose, they connect to your middle ear cavity, which is where those ear bones are. We've actually talked about these. I mentioned it back when we talked about the temporal bone, which is what these are in. This bump here behind your ear, remember, is the mastoid process. And that's where you find those. They connect to your middle ear cavity, which does not obviously have anything to do with your nose. But if you remember, there is a tube that connects your middle ear cavity to your nasopharynx, and that's the auditory or eustachian tube. So it's a very indirect, but there is a connection. You know, they connect to the middle ear. Auditory tube connects to the nasopharynx. Nasopharynx connects to the nose. So it's a connection, but really not a true connection. The last structure, not a sinus, but it is something that does connect to the nose, and it is visible in the image, and that is one of the two that's color or visible here, and that's the nasolacrimal duct. Drains secretions from the lacrimal gland, in other words, tears into the nasal cavity. So we've talked about all these. Some of them we didn't see, or like the mastoids. I've never shown you pictures of those before, but I've talked about them. So any questions? All right, nothing else to color, so we'll close up shop there. All right, we'll start with the pharynx on Tuesday next week. I don't want to start it. There's a lot to get through on this slide, and we've only got a few minutes. So we'll start fresh with the pharynx, or our throat, as we will commonly call it, when I see you guys in a week. Have a great rest of your day. See you soon.